All right, so for today's session, we have a nice, exciting group to present with us today here from the Waterloo Region District School Board. They're going to talk to us about redesigning and redefining ESL documentation and supports as a system with Brightspace. So I'm happy to present. We have Andrew Baronsky, Sharon Newmaster, Loretta Newfield Van de Sand, Lara Shantz, and Kimiko Shibata. So I'm going to pass the mic over to them for their presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Roseanne, for the introduction, and thanks to D2L and the Fusion team for having us here today. Going to switch over to a screen share really quick, so just bear with me while we get this up and running. And Roseanne, while you're unmuted, could you let me know, can you see the screen right now in my presentation?
I can see it, and now I can see presenter mode. Yep.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So it's my pleasure to kind of get us started today, but I'm not going to take too long. I'm going to pass it off to the experts who are on the ground floor and really doing this work and who you probably really want to hear from. So as Roseanne mentioned, the title we're looking at today is Redesigning and Redefining ESL Documentation Supports as a System with Brightspace. And really we wanted to start off with just a bit of a story and tell you our journey and how we're kind of where we were, how we got to where we are today, and kind of where we see ourselves going, and then hearing from the team that's making this happen in our board. Quick introductions, and you'll hear more from them themselves, and they'll introduce themselves a little bit when we get to that. But quickly for myself, my name is Andrew Baronsky. I'm what's known as the TELT consultant for my school board, or Technology-Enabled Learning and Teaching Consultant. It's a role in Ontario specifically. There's one tied to every school board that the ministry supports having. Basically, my role is to support students and teachers in K-12 using technology in the classroom, but a lot of that ends up being via Brightspace. And so that's kind of my role within the board. The team we have here is truly a set of rock stars, and like I'm blown away by each of them continually. So we've got Sharon Newmaster, who works in our board for learning support services as a consultant, supporting our K-8 ESL and ELD programming. We'll talk about terminology a little bit later for our Ontario context. Loretta Newfield Van de Sand, teaching and learning division consultant, was in the role Sharon was in last year, and is still doing a lot of work to support our ESL and ELD learners. Lara Shantz, Learning Support Services side as consultant, specifically working in secondary with ELLs, and Kimiko, who's actually a really nice mix of both in the classroom and kind of a consultancy role and working in that K-8 division. So you'll hear from all of them very soon, and they'll do a better intro than I can do for them coming up shortly. So to start off here, really want to talk about the work we're doing with our ELLs and the kind of things we're seeing and the improvements we're kind of hoping to make. But I do want to start off on just the technical side a little bit and talk about how did we get here and why have we been making this transition? We're very early in. To start, a little context, so the Waterloo Region District School Board is a board of about 65,000 students or so. We're across K-12. It's a public institution in the province of Ontario in Canada, and we're in the southwestern region for Waterloo Region, which makes up Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge, and some surrounding towns and districts. What we were really trying to get at here and why we're looking at this transition to Brightspace is there was identified, like, we're really looking at how do we document rich and informative observations, kind of conversations and assessments that can be accessed by everyone easily. And if you've done any work with English language learners and in the education system, I think talking to other boards and other people who do this work, that's been a consistent pain point for a lot of people for a long time. In our Ontario context, most outside of ESL and ELD, but in general, our assessment practices are guided by growing success and really talking about how do we do that triangulation of assessment, look at observations, conversations, and products, and blend all those things together and have everyone involved in that learning process. And so one of the things we're looking at, so we have our English language learner leads who are working in schools and with the school board. We've got our students, we've got our classroom teachers, administrators, parents and guardians, and more. How do we make all this work and information accessible to everybody in a way that's going to work? In my role, I've only been in this role as that TELT consultant I was mentioning, supporting Brightspace for a little under 2 years now. And at the start of the previous school year, which with COVID right now, it feels like it was like 3 or 4 years ago. But as I'm saying this, it was really not that long ago. It was like just over a school year ago. I was sitting down into my new role, and I had a brand new administrator who was taking on this portfolio for Brightspace within our board and our e-learning program, which was historically the focus for Brightspace for us. And I was just introducing him and talking about Brightspace and some of the tools and how it works within our board. And he also had our ELL portfolio. And as I was kind of listing some of the things and talking about some of the tools within Brightspace, I could kind of see his eyes getting wider and wider. And he's like, I just want to stop and like, have we looked at this for our English language learners at all? Because we're going through like a years-long process now of trying to find resources and tools to do a lot of the things that you're talking about doing. He's like, are you telling me we already have access to this? Is this something we could be using? I'm like, yeah, we do. And so that was the kind of start of the genesis of just saying, hey, our board was looking to make a transition to find software and tools and resources available to support this work. And maybe Brightspace was going to be an answer to a lot of that. And so that kind of leads me into like the where and how of our start. And so from that initial meeting, he left off and brought some of our leads in and just started sitting down and talking about, okay, here's what we currently do. Here's what we would like to do. Where does Brightspace fit into this picture? And is it going to be a good option for us? And the more and more we talked with some reps from D2L and the people doing the work in our board and looking at it, we started seeing some really positive connections and some good opportunities. And again, there was a transition for us. Like we were very much paper-based in a lot of ways. You'll hear more about the purple folders in our board, which is rarely where previously all this work generally lived. Is that we had an English language learner lead supporting sometimes hundreds of students across multiple schools. And generally a lot of that work and information lived with that person. And they were doing the best they can to connect with other teachers in the classroom and families. But it was very paper-based and kind of tied to whoever had that paper or purple folder at that time. And so we started looking at like, okay, how can we maybe enhance this and move this forward a little bit and bring more people in? And so some of the big questions that this group was looking at early on was to start, how do we digitally document in the moment learning to support that for and as learning with all the stakeholders? Again, it's not just living with one person. How do we make this more accessible for all? And what came clear pretty quickly is that's really what the Brightspace portfolio tool does. It works on the web or via an app, but via that app on a tablet or a mobile phone for the student, for a teacher, for a parent from home, which we're seeing right now, is they can open that up very quickly and then take a quick picture or video and then add an audio reflection and tag that off and share that across the system that can be looked at and reviewed by people and feedback can be given. And for me, that was like, again, not living in the yellow world. That was in itself was a game changer. If we're talking about language development, if we're talking about reading fluency, those are things, again, it's hard to document that and track that with just paper-based notes over time. Actually seeing a student or hearing a student, that can be really transformative and giving access to the classroom teacher, to the ELL lead, to the student, to the parent or guardian with a few clicks, I think is really has the opportunity to be a really amazing thing. The next part, and they'll explain this a bit later in our presentation, looking at step documentation, which is a bit more of a formal process. What does that look like? I'd say this is one we're still working through and we're early into this work this year. But the Brightspace rubrics tool opens up some opportunities for us to share a template system-wide, make that accessible to teachers across our system, and to use that tracking both formally and informally. And then maybe the potentiality to looking at Brightspace assignments for having some formal documentation tracking and also collecting some system data out of that. And then lastly, how do we organize this and share it across the system? And we've got 65,000 students across K-12, across more than 120 schools, not all, which obviously are ELL, but many of that population is. And so how do we support that? And so what we've done locally here is working with our IT team, we've set up an automation with Brightspace and our student information system, which basically creates an ESL and an ELD shell for each of our 120 plus schools. And then as long as those students are identified as English language learners, they are automatically enrolled in those classes. So we have that kind of as a base in the startup. All right, honestly, that's probably the boring part of this presentation and why we got to it. What I'm really excited to is more pass it off to the people who are actually doing this work and living it and kind of how do you leverage those experiences. So I'm really excited to pass it off to Sharon Newmaster now. So Sharon, I want to take it from here.
Yep, thank you, Andrew. Well, maybe this is still a little bit of the boring bit, but at least I'll provide you with the context. So my name's Sharon Newmaster, and I work as the ESL ELD consultant at Waterloo Region District School Board for K-8. However, the last 2 years I've been working in a provincial role supporting over 70 public school boards, and every school board in Ontario would have English language learners. And this has certainly been the focus of my work, is around supporting what they call STEP implementation. So the context in Ontario, just so you know, 50%, Ontario sees over 50% of all newcomers come to Canada. So there's a lot, the majority do come to Ontario. And of our population, over 25% of the population are newcomers. And certainly this is reflected in our board. We have at least around 25% of our learners that speak a first language other than English or French. Of those newcomers too, and this might be a little different than if you're listening in from the US, is 80% of those newcomers speak over 22 key languages. And by key languages, I mean there's 100,000 plus speakers of those languages. So the diversity of language is unusual too. So lots of diversity there. Next slide, please. This all came about through this ministry policy in 2007. This came out of an auditor's general report in 2005, making recommendations to our province. So since then, we've been trying to follow through with all these policies, and it establishes the mandates of what every school board must do. The MOE refers, that's the Ministry of Education, refers to our linguistically and culturally diverse students as English language learners. I know sometimes in the States, they may be referred to as English learners, multilingual learners, but for the purpose of this presentation, we will use English language learners. In our province too, we also recognize 2 types of programming streams. We have ESL, English as a second language, and ELD, English literacy development. So our ESL refers to students that are literate in a first language and probably or most likely have formal schooling in that language, whereas ELD refers to students that have come to Canada maybe from refugee backgrounds who have not had access to formal schooling and may have limited literacy ability in their first language. So those are 2 different programming streams that we have in Ontario. Next slide, please. So STEPS came about, again, it was out of the Auditor General's report that said that our province must have a way to measure students' English language proficiency, and that this must be measured on a yearly basis. So this is where the development of STEPS came about. So you can see here, the purpose is really to help us identify who the students are, but it's used not just for documenting language. This is also used as a resource for classroom teachers, and it was developed for use by classroom teachers. And it's really intended to help differentiate instruction and assessment, for lesson planning, as well as assessing that ongoing language progression and helping classroom teachers understand really what ELLs can do. It's very asset-based. It's really looking at what kids can do, and it can be used across all content areas, not just in a language classroom. It can be used in a math classroom, social studies, science, any of those areas. Next, please. This is just so you can see quickly what it looks like. This is why you can see it. As soon as we heard about the rubrics in the portfolio, we thought, oh, this might work. It's set up much like a rubric with a chart. This is the one for ESL. This is the resource or continuum for ESL. There's also one for ELD, and you can see that it'll go from step 1 to step 6, with step 1 being our beginner learners. Down the sides, you'll see the elements. Those are the pieces. They are closely aligned to our language curriculum. So it's nothing, so teachers can recognize that. So it's something that they're doing within the context of their teaching. There's different grade strands. We have, there's a newly developed one that's for kindergarten that some boards are using. They're just rolling that out now. But then there's primary for grade 1 to 3, 4 to 6, 7 to 8, and then 9 to 12. Next slide, please. So how we were documenting this for many years now, it's been a struggle. It's just on a paper document. So teachers literally take a highlighter, and when the child consistently just demonstrates one of these observable language behaviors, you would highlight that and date it. And so that's what usually that's held by the ESL teacher and shared with the classroom teacher when we sit down to do any co-planning or co-assessing of students. But it's very difficult, unless you're making multiple copies, to really know where kids are at and to share this information easily. Next slide. If some of you are listening in from the United States, and even internationally, I know this is another resource that is widely used called the WIDA, similar in setup and similar in purpose. You can see it's also a tool that has been developed like a rubric as well. So maybe if you're not using something like we are, like different provinces have their own charts like this as well. It still might be a tool. You still might be able to use rubrics and portfolio the way we're using it with STEP. Next slide, please. So the key issue for us, and has been throughout the province, this in my provincial role, is something that I heard boards struggling with, is that because we don't have a centralized student information system, it's been very difficult to have a way to document this through centralized process throughout the province. So bigger boards, they have the finances, so they were able to develop some really slick in-house tools. But often, even if they wanted to share with other boards, because we had different student information systems, it just didn't work at the other boards, or there'd be a substantial cost involved in making it work. Smaller boards were left then to use Google Docs or paper copies, and that works if you're a very small board and you're only tracking a few hundred students, but we were tracking thousands of students, up to 20% of our school boards. So it becomes very problematic with paper and Google Docs. Next slide, please. So finally, for my section here, just to leave you with the key driving factors when we are looking at this, is to really build our capacity of classroom teachers. In Ontario, it's only been since 2015 that faculties of education have been mandated to include a section on supporting English language learners. So many of our classroom teachers have never had any training around supporting English language learners. So this is a great way to get some of that capacity building into our classrooms. We also want to provide more integrated, inclusive models of support. Often we are doing a lot of withdrawal support, and we know that, it's better. The kids always want to be in class, and they need to hear speakers of first language too. So we wanted to be able to provide more integrated supports for them. And finally, the accountability. We want to make sure that we're able to provide equitable access for education for all our ELLs, and we can't do that if we're not paying attention and tracking to see what they're doing and how well they're doing. So at that point, I'd like to hand it over now to Loretta.
Thank you, Sharon. My name is Loretta Neufeld-Vandesand, and I was replacing Sharon for the last 2 years in the role as the ESL consultant 8. And now I am working in learning services in our board, and I continue to support ELLs and our department as well. Just wanted to go over a couple things. So we have 104 elementary schools in our school board. We have approximately 60 full-time ESL educators. And at our board, we have our ESL department is centralized staffing. So it's based, and we allocate them as based on student need. That is determined by step levels. And as Sharon said, our board has about 20% ELLs in our board. So that would be about 13,000 students altogether in elementary and secondary. Next, oh, thank you, Andrew. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about our past practice, which is not much in our past. It's just last year, and that this year we've kind of changing some things. And I want to talk to you about the purple folder. The purple folder is a folder that we would hold a lot of information regarding our ELLs. And first thing would be the documentation of initial assessment. So as a newcomer comes into our board, we would do an initial assessment on that student to evaluate their oral reading and writing and some math. So, and then we would place them on initial assessment step continua, and that would be sort of their starting point. So we would have some work in there, we'd have the initial assessment in there. And as Sharon mentioned, we had our step tracking sheets, and they went from grades 1 to 3, 4 to 6, 7, 8, 9 to 12. And then we had our ELD that went from grades 3 to 12. And we would use those tracking sheets about twice a year. We would sit down with the teacher to track the oral reading and writing language proficiency of our ELLs. As Sharon mentioned, we would do that highlighting on the tracking sheet. I wouldn't say there was a lot of collaboration that happened. I mean, we worked with the classroom teacher to do that, but beyond that, sometimes that was it. So we really wanted something more than that. So I'll go into that afterwards. Student work also was located in this folder, and this folder was not accessible to all educators. I basically was housed with the ESL teacher in a filing cabinet in a box. And so we wanted something that would be accessible to all. So we needed a solution. The first thing is pedagogical documentation across the curriculum over time. So instead of just having those flat pieces of documentation in a purple folder, we want to have sort of more live documentation and linking it to the STEP continua. We want an integration of content and language instruction. So looking at our curriculum and then looking at the STEP, that language proficiency in oral reading and writing to ensure that academic conversations in various learning contexts take place. And then also we wanted collaboration between educators to improve student learning outcomes and teacher professional outcomes. In terms of students, we really wanted students to feel like they belong in the class with a classroom teacher and sort of doing sort of that documentation on their own as well. So in sort of empowering students to become part of the process. And also we wanted, oh, can you go back, Andrew? I'm not quite done. We really wanted teachers to work together more collaboratively, where all educators share the ownership of all our English language learners, and that all educators need to see themselves as language teachers to all students. Next slide, please. Okay, here we go. Setting up for success. Okay, as Andrew mentioned, he created ESL and ELD shells for each of our schools, and our student information system connected with D2L to upload all those ELLs into the correct shells. And then we also created, so our STEP tracking sheets have now been created in rubrics within Portfolio. And thanks to Andrew for advocating that we needed more than 4 levels for our ESL students. We needed actually 6. So he was instrumental in getting that in place for us. And then our ELD STEP is levels 1 to 4. So once we created these rubrics and imported them into the core shells, now when evidence is uploaded into Portfolio, the rubrics are right there, and I'll show you on the next slide. Okay, so as you can see, in Portfolio, educators can use STEP as a resource tool for learning and as learning to monitor progress and language proficiency across the curriculum. Pedagogical documentation is accessible to all educators of a student. So they could be put into these shells and then they have access to all the student work. We're using STEP tracking in the moment. So if you look on down below, I just did an example of a writing sample called Jellyfish. And so once that is uploaded to Portfolio, then where it says add rubrics, that's where all our rubrics are housed now. And then on the top, I've shown you a variety of our rubrics that we have, and we've kind of separated them. So we have oral, reading, and writing separated, and then we also have them together. So there's lots of variation on how you can use the rubrics. So say for this example in writing, you would choose a writing rubric, and then you can look at that piece of writing, and then right away you can be like, okay, click, what do I see that student doing? And then I can also look at what is next. What are my teacher moves to help move that student forward? We're really hoping to have some more parent engagement when we actually can have parents back into our schools to meet with our students, where we can actually bring up the Portfolio and show parents student work and have that more richer conversations about where their child is at in their learning. And of course, all the stuff in Portfolio is archived from year to year, and it will stay with the student until they graduate. So it's a nice way to see the progression of language and their growth over time. I think that's all for me, and I'm going to pass it now to Laura, and she can give you some information on the secondary piece.
All right, hello everybody. We have 16 high schools in our secondary panel, but 4 of those high schools are what we call magnet sites for English language learners. So 4 of our high schools have significant ESL and ELD programs. So most of my work is focusing on supporting educators at those sites. And so in terms of using STEP as a helpful tool, we've been a little bit broken for a while because of the limits of paper. And on the one hand, STEP is a tool to assess the student, but on the other hand, it's an incredible tool for educators and decision makers like guidance counselors and administrators to help them understand each student better and help make decisions and or advocate for that student. So they need that information. And currently, teachers can only see a student's STEP level on their initial class list, printed out and distributed on paper or in PDF form, I think this year. But there's not a way currently to look it up in the system. So each school has set up their own spreadsheets to enter STEP data, and a teacher could take initiative to look their student up. But typically teachers just kind of connect with a colleague and say, hey, what do you know about this kid? Struggling a little bit in my course, can you give me some more context? Which leads to a very hit and miss approach. It's dependent on teachers taking that extra time and initiative to go find out about a student or to do a lot of the diagnostic work in their course, in their classroom to find out where the student's at. And as we know, sometimes there's not time for that, or there's not enough time right at the beginning for that. And then we're so far in before we realize things are not going well for a student and we could have been doing things better, differentiating, accommodating, scaffolding for a student to meet them where they were at. So if you want to go to the next slide, Andrew, portfolio improves that dramatically because as we get into a practice of at a minimum, at every opportunity for STEP evaluation, which for us is once a semester, currently once a quadmester, we're going to be asking teachers to document the most recent writing sample that they have for that student, some way of documenting their most recent reading abilities and comprehension. And that could be even as simple as showing a page of the type of text that that student is successfully reading at. And then some kind of oral sample, a conversation with the teacher, perhaps a presentation, or just a short recording that the student makes on their own. So then once that oral reading writing samples are in portfolio, then any future teachers or current teachers, and we are striving to make that accessible beyond, again, for guidance counselors and VPs, to be able to look in the portfolio, see where the student is at in terms of their English proficiency, and then be able to tailor and respond appropriately to that student's needs and next step. So that leads us to be much more on target with our approaches, our planning, our decision-making, and our advocacy for these students. Next slide. So what we're aiming for are these best practices, which are empowered by portfolio. So as all educators start to see these samples attached to a STEP level, because the STEP Continua rubric would be present with it, every teacher is going to start to build their understanding of, oh, this is what ESL Step 3 work looks like, or an ELD Step 2 reader. This is what I could anticipate from them. So the more we're seeing it and seeing documentation, the more we all come to understand better what steps mean. And a science teacher could then be documenting evidence of reading, writing, or oral for their ELL in science class and saying, hey, this is science, but it's also about language and literacy proficiency. So if I document it, that's going to help inform our assessment of what step this student is at. So again, eventually all teachers are contributing to that STEP evaluation rather than it just being their language teacher. And of course, we already have a little bit of this starting to happen, but our students then can look back and have a little historical tour of where they started and how they've made progress. And that can be just so powerful. As teachers, we can tell them that, but when they can see it for themselves and their parents can see it and we can celebrate it with them, that's a powerful motivator and a great reason to celebrate. So lots of promise with Portfolio. And I'm going to hand it over to Kimiko.
Great. Hi, my name is Kimiko Shibata. I'm an elementary ESL resource teacher, so I serve kindergarten to grade 8 in the Waterloo Region District School Board. And we typically have several schools on each of our ESL teacher caseloads. For me personally, the portfolio function is the best reason for using Brightspace. I was initially quite wary of Brightspace as a platform initially, but Portfolio was the gateway tool that really hooked me in. I've been experimenting with co-teaching with classroom teachers for the past few years, and we just didn't have time in our schedules to have common prep times, and I was frequently traveling between multiple schools every day on lunch breaks. So we just really needed to find ways to collaborate and find that time for co-assessment, for co-planning and co-teaching purposes, even when we weren't going to be in the same room or even the same school at the same time. So we started off using shared Google Docs and Google Keep, trying to sort of hack that to try to keep track of work samples and ongoing assessment. I was really trying to pull my teaching partners into the assessment piece with me. And so you can see from the little chart I made up there on the slide deck, some of the things we were able to do. But I quickly realized that all of the evidence that we were collecting and collaborating on, it only lived in individual teachers' drives. It didn't travel with the kids. And so when I moved to new schools, and the evidence then moved with me, and then I had to go through hundreds of files and share them all with the next teacher. And it was horrendous and so much work. So I was trying so hard to just, use digital tools and get away from paper, but it wasn't working. And the other part of that is that the kids weren't able to document any of their own learning. So it just ended up creating more work for the teachers. Evidence ended up getting lost in the shuffle. There was no way to attach a tracking sheet or a rubric to the work that we were doing. And we were very frustrated and looking for a way to work smarter, not harder. So then Andrew came and said, hey, I've got this great new tool, and it's Portfolio in D2L's Brightspace, and check it out. This was honestly a game changer. I was in love from day one. The day after I learned how it worked, I used it with my students right away. And then the day after that, I was teaching my grade 1 teaching partners how to use it in their classrooms. So after literally one small group guided session, all of my kids were able to independently navigate the app and document their own evidence of learning for teachers to later review whenever we had the time to do so. We were using primarily the Funster mode in primary and junior, and that's just honestly the easiest tool to use with our primary and junior ELLs, because it's just so highly visual. It has those simple auditory prompts. It has intuitive buttons for little hands. Students were uploading evidence and adding their own comments while teachers were working with small groups and individuals in the classrooms. It really freed us up to be more effective with our instructional time. And it allowed us to collaborate later on. Sometimes it was, after my daughter went to bed, or on my prep time or their prep time or a lunchtime or whenever, to actually collaborate online, whether or not we were in the same building. It was great. Really just freed us up to be so much more effective with our time. And I did actually get a chance to film a few of my students learning to use the app for the first time. So Andrew can press play on the next slide, and you can actually see how super easy it was for them to navigate this tool.
A carrot, they bought tomatoes, they bought a bread, they bought a cookies.
Okay, and then you can read your work to them.
Tap the button to start recording.
I brushed my teeth.
Thanks so much.
They're just too cute, aren't they? But yeah, it was just so great for them to be able to independently document that evidence of learning all on their own, and then we could go back and review it when we had the time to do so. No papers, no stuff to lose. I love having everything in one place, and just the idea of this traveling with them. So, when they're starting with me in kindergarten, by the time they get up to Lara, up at the end of their high school career, they can actually see where they started off. It's amazing, an amazing tool.
Okay, Kimiko, thank you all, Kimiko, especially for that piece and that making that video, and to all of you for sharing there. That's kind of the formal end of our presentation and kind of walking through the pieces and our journey, our thinking, and how bright spaces fit into that, and kind of empowered us to look at how we do our step documentation differently. I'll mention very quickly, just to Kimiko's last point there that she was mentioning, in Ontario, this is bright spaces supplied across the province in K-12 to public education systems. And so we have a unique identifier for students across the province. And so that portfolio documentation follows them through that. So for us, if a student's at, say, school A for kindergarten, and the teacher does some documentation, the student parent do some documentation, put that in their portfolio, even if the student, say, moves to a different school for grade 2, that portfolio documentation gets archived, for kindergarten, and follows that student for their entire school career across K-12 with us. And so even in a new school, they're in that new class now with that new teacher, that grade 1 teacher in August, even before classes start, who has that student on the roster now, can go to that student's portfolio, see the documentation that they're going to do, but just underneath that, look at previous documentation from archive classes from previous years, listen. And I think that's just so transformative and powerful for any student, for any learning, but especially for our ELL. So that teacher can get a sense like, hey, this is what the reading fluency is like. This is their oral communication skills. This is their writing at the end of kindergarten. What are they walking into? And then we can see that progression. And also, again, as was mentioned in this presentation, bringing in the teacher, bringing in the parent or guardian, bringing in the supports and looking at that together, I think is just so powerful and has really great opportunities. And I'm so excited to see where these amazing people in our system takes it. So that brings a kind of a formal end to our presentation, but we do have an option for Q&A. I haven't had a chance here with sharing to monitor the chat or the Q&A. So if anyone else wants to speak there, Roseanne, if you want to drop in, if you saw anything in there, please feel free. We're happy to answer any questions you have. So drop in the chat or into the Q&A and we'll speak to it.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. We will take a minute to wait to see if we have any questions. I do want to read out some of the nice comments from the chat so that they get onto the recording. So we have April saying, this is so excellent. Thank you so much for this presentation. So informative. Definitely something that other boards can replicate to help streamline documentation for our ELL students. So really some positive feedback there. And we do have a question from Greta asking, do students still have access to items in their portfolio even after a course closes or a course becomes inactive?
Yeah, so I can tackle that one. And if you ever want to address something to someone specifically, feel free to mention them by name in the chat and they can pop on. But so yes, from the way it's set up for us in Ontario, specifically, and Brightspace in general for the student, I believe, and Roseanne might be able to speak to this piece too. But for us, the student has access to their portfolio. So within Brightspace, a student can go to My Portfolio. They'll see their classes listed there, and they'll see a historical documentation of their classes as they take them. In Brightspace, your class is active or inactive. So while a student's in a class, it's active, they have access to it and can populate that way. Generally, depending on your setup, it will become inactive, or the course end date will come as a student moves on through grades or classes, and then they will still have that historical access. So for us, it works in 2 levels. One, the student always has access through K-12. So again, if we can jump ahead 12 years from now, this kindergarten documentation is happening now. If this takes us for us and this rolls for a system, a student can actually go back and compare, like, this is what my reading was like in kindergarten. This was what my reading was like in grade 3. This is what my reading was like in grade 6. Like, I'm actually really excited to jump like 4 years into the future and talk to students and look at those things. So the student has all of that information. But then the access point for the teacher is really great too. So teachers don't have access to every kid in the board, but they do have access to the students who are in their classes. So in that context I was speaking before, one teacher, even at one school on our board for a student in kindergarten, family moves to a new neighborhood and is at a new school for grade 1. That teacher who has that student in their class in grade 1 at the new school now logs into their Brightspace classroom, clicks on portfolio, clicks that student profile. The focus at the top will be their current documentation they're going to be doing for that student. But if they scroll down, they can also access the historical evidence from previous classes for that student. Roseanne, on the D2L side, do you have anything to add to that, or does that pretty much cover it all?
Yep, that pretty much covers it. And this, I just wrote in the chat, this is true outside of Ontario as well. And it will actually show up as what's called archived. So then the student can go in, even if they're not able to access that course, they'll have that archived portfolio, and the teacher will be able to see the student's past work as well. And then just for anyone who's not reading the chat, Laura just wanted to add that in addition to documentation in portfolio, we will also be using our student information system, so their SIS, to document and track our STEP data, which equals varied and multiple sources of data. Awesome. All right, do we have any other questions for our group today? All right, this was very informative. So I want to take a second to thank Andrew, Sharon, Loretta, Laura, and Kimiko once again for presenting on this topic for us today. If anyone is interested in learning a little bit more about portfolio, actually our next session coming up at 3 p.m. is from one of our French language school boards, CSA Mon Avenir. We have a couple of representatives coming to talk about exploring active learning environments through the use of Brightspace Portfolio. So it'll be a really nice transition if you're looking for one more session to cap off your Fusion experience. All of our session recordings will be live in Fusion On Demand 48 hours after the session, so you can definitely check everything out after that. Once again, thank you to our panelists, and I hope everyone has a lovely afternoon.
Thank you, Roseanne. All the best, all. And again, huge thank you to the group that came and presented. You're amazing.